So I am not Muhammad Ali, but we're going to try to make this thing work very well tonight. So we're going to have a little bit of a setup. What are the trends for PRRS and Mycoplasma? Updates on some PVC2 going on in this country. And then why is it important to vaccinate the sow herd with PCV2? So that's kind of where we're going to be. Some of the background, you know, the 3-flex and flex combo combinations, things like that. And the take-home message is where I'm going to give you actual farm experiences. Some of them date back a few years. But before we get into that, in this setup, these 4 university diagnostic laboratories have went together and funded by what we call SHIC, or part of our Pork Producer Association, where some of the funds go. And you can see the website at the bottom. Anybody can access this information. It's public knowledge, but it shows trends. It shows what is going on with our diseases in the United States. To start with, let's just take a look at current pathogens. This is over June the 1st of this year to July the 11th, so it's very, very recent. Out of these 4 laboratories, we get PRRS as our number 1. When it comes to systemic means that it's more than just a single organ, like a lung or a kidney, as you'll see in a little bit. So PRRS, of course, is number 1. We're dealing with a lot of strep suis, primarily post-weaning today. You'll see a name change. This is what you and I know as Haemophilus parasuis. But circovirus continues to this day to be the 4th most significant systemic pathogen that we have. If we want to look at PRRS by itself, you can go into this website and you can select different categories. You can actually select the tissue or the specimen that was submitted by the attending veterinarian. So this is the number of accessions or submissions to the 4 different laboratories. The red would be the positive cases. This blue-green or whatever color it comes through as is the negative. Of course, it also has season of the year, winter, spring, summer, fall. And the current season that we're in, of course, is not complete. That's why it's not clear up to the top. Almost immediately after we say though the incident rate of PRRS, people are asking about the diversity of PRRS. In other words, what strain or strains are the most common? And you can see this would be the 174 strain, and then we've got some others. But if I just look at 2020, this year, you can see the 2 most significant strains on the top. The second one is actually vaccine virus. So 184, 174, those are the ones that cause us the most problems. A very interesting paper that's just recently been published, and you can see July of this year, is showing that in the United States, we're having less diversity. Now, we're not sure what this means, if this is part of our biosecurity programs that we've ramped up here in this country, or is it the amount of vaccine that's being used? So there's still questions, but it does show that we are making headway, and maybe we can get to the point where there's less PRRS breaks. So again, if we want to look at geographic information as well as sample information, I just selected 2 years, 2019, 2020, this year not being complete yet. But you can see grow finish makes a large portion of the age that veterinarians are sampling. Nursery, grow finish, this would be the suckling pigs. And then this is where an unknown almost always is the lab submission was not complete for whatever reason. This would be the sample or specimen, processing fluids, serum, oral fluids. Those are going to be the 3 most common And then at any given point, we can look at different states and see who might be submitting the most, and of course the positives. Again, in the summertime, we have seen and published in this country a very seasonal trend to PERS. And then it starts to ramp up in the fall, usually October, November, and by winter, we're hitting our peak. Let's move now to Mycoplasma. Again, the submissions are not as many, but still you can see a bit of a trend. Fall seems to pop out in several of these years. We're getting a little of that in the fall and winter months here. This again would be positive. So not as many submissions, but again, you can select and you can drill down to get whatever information you'd like. This shows that grow finish makes up the majority of the submissions on Mycoplasma. Let's move into circovirus. Circovirus got its name because of its appearance in a cell culture. It looks like this in cell cultures, and it's easy to identify by virologists and pathologists. This data is a bit dated, but it definitely shows that in the genotypes, PCV2D, D as in dog, is the primary genotype in our industries. And that started somewhere around 2013, 14, and continues to be that today. So now if we want to look at some circovirus data from these, this is predominantly from Iowa State now. This is not part of that original grouping that I mentioned. So I selected 2017, 18, and 19 just to look at trends. Again, predominantly it's diagnosed as a systemic problem or a lung problem. And you can see the number of cases where virus was actually found, and it's causing multi-systemic, meaning it's found in several organs, kidneys, livers, whatever. And then also the number of times it's caused pneumonia. But you can see abortion is right, it's coming in third place. So it's significant in some sow herds. Before we get into that, let's take a look at this study from South Korea. I think this is a pivotal study, and I'm excited to be able to share it with you. It's not been published that long ago. It was in 2019, so it's relevant. This is where they took pigs and they made non-vaccinated groups and vaccinated groups, and then exposed them to PCV2A or 2B or 2D. And it clearly shows that if you use a vaccine like Circoflex, you're going to have cross protection. Well, let's jump into the actual data. So in the graph here at the top, this would be the control animals that were not vaccinated, but one group, and you can see the color coding on this side of the screen, shows the 2A exposure, the 2B exposure, and the 2D exposure. And you get a very similar amount of virus found, and it's called virus load in the tissues. Now, if they go into the control group, which would no longer be a control group, it'd be a treatment group, and they vaccinated with Circoflex, then all three groups performed similar when exposed to 2A or 2B or 2D. Hopefully I illustrated that correctly, and you have this in your mind now. So if we look at white blood cell responses, in this particular case, it's a cytokine type of a response, very, very similar to the first chart. And if you look at titers, again, by log titers to PCV2, very similar. This would be the control groups where they're not vaccinated. This would be the vaccinated groups. So it clearly shows that a vaccine like Circoflex can protect against these other genotypes. It doesn't mean that in the future you you won't get a PCV2D vaccine on the market. It just means right now we can use the tool with confidence. Let's talk about the sow herd. This is probably my one area of production that I have the most passion for is the sow herd. This was a picture of a litter that Dr. Darwin Madsen, when he was at Iowa State, sent to me. I like this illustration because it shows where our focus has been up to this point. It's been in the pigs, right at weaning or prior to weaning. It's been in, so our focus is to prevent problems in the finishing floor. And we know about vaccinating gilts. But what about the sow herd? In other words, we're back to this whole population approach to controlling disease. Jeremy Pittman in 2008, soon after we got the vaccine. So we knew about PCVAD in this country, somewhere about 2004 to 2006. It was just becoming an uncontrollable disease, and it was costing us lots of economic damage. And he was able to clearly show that in this paper where for about 10 weeks, abortions and stillborn pigs were occurring. So it's the reason why we have vaccinated the replacement gilts for all these years. So this is the whole herd approach. This is the infectious chains, as we've talked about in the past to many of you. We've got the gilt source coming into the gilt development and then the sow herd, and that influences the health in the nursery and finisher. We've known that with PRRS, we've known that with Microplasma. So this is what we call vertical transmission. Sow gives the pathogen to her offspring. And then you may or may not see disease here in grow finish. So what do we know about PCV2? We know that a sow can be viremic, and it is possible. It's a very common route for that virus then to move from the sow's blood into the developing fetuses. We know that it can be found in her colostrum, in her milk. So there's another exposure. We also know that this virus can be found in boar semen, which can infect the sow herd. So very good reasons why we need to vaccinate that sow herd. So my experiences, the very first herd that I vaccinated the sow herd was in 2000, probably 2008. We had already been vaccinating the piglets. At that time, we still had a limited number of vaccine doses available to us, but we were able to get enough to mass vaccinate this 300 sow herd. And to describe this herd for you, so you've got a mindset of it, it was a two-site, although the nursery was on the same site as the sow herd. Across the road was the finisher site. So we decided, and again, we didn't have the diagnostic tools available to us at that point, nor did we have the knowledge that we have today. But it was the success of this that led me to vaccinating other herds. This is the response, and I was able to gather enough years to show you the trends. And this is the first chart on the left. Excuse me. This pigs wean per mated female per year. This vertical red line is when we vaccinated. You can see it's right in that 2007 year. Actually, it was about late fall or January. And then the closeout, what we're looking at is the closeout of each year thereafter, had a nice response. The same with litter weight. And I only used two charts just to illustrate the number of pigs being weaned. Total born was up, stillborns went down. So we didn't do a lot of diagnostics on this prior to the mass vaccination. He was mass vaccinating the sow herd for PRRS, although we did not have field virus. He was Mycoplasma positive, so another reason to vaccinate the sow herd, so we just incorporated the Circoflex right into this vaccine program. This is a study now that I performed with Dr. Mike Murtaugh in 2010, and this solidified my thinking. So we now went 2 years, 2008 into 2010, and this solidified my approach to the sow herd. My client is this farm 3. Mike came to me and said he wanted another vaccinated sow herd to be in his study of 6 farms. And so this is what we did. This farm 3 was negative for PRRS and not vaccinating for PRRS, naive for Mycoplasma and not vaccinating for Mycoplasma. But we did have weak pigs at birth, and we found the circovirus viremia in those pigs. We vaccinated the sow herd, and that's why it was entered into this study. So what did we find? We found even in vaccinated farms, you can still have piglets born with virus in the blood. That's what it means here by being viremic. And it was PCV2B at this time in all 6 farms. So this was before the 2013-14 when, for whatever reason, 2D became the most important. So back to the study. There was no effect by parity. There was virus in the colostrum. There was virus in oral fluids. There was virus in the bearing crate after we loaded the sow. So there was virus everywhere. And that is another reason why we wanted to vaccinate. So what did I learn out of this study? That infection occurs very early, most of the time in gestation, where the fetuses are being developed. It's everywhere. It's even in the environment. Transmission is not affected by age of the sow or status on viremia or level of immunity. But to help control PCVAD and sow herd health, vaccination was important. So as we get into this, now we're going to swing a little bit into some of the background. We want flexibility. So we want the flexibility. We want to maintain protection. I'm going to show a couple of more slides on the dynamic aspect of pathogens. They don't stay the same day in and day out. And the reason I'm showing this is because we need more flexibility in our vaccine programs. This is a 300 sow farrow to finish, multiple locations. Sow herd was all in one location. Nursery he had a couple, 3 different nursery locations, and then numerous finishing locations. At this particular time, you can see age along the bottom, 3, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22 weeks of age. We had a porcine respiratory disease complex going on in the late finishing. Very typical of gastric ulcers, bleached out pigs, higher mortality. We made some changes, and by January, we still had exposure to Mycoplasma. It was late enough that we did not have the porcine respiratory disease complex. It was still there, but it was not causing us concern. So the vaccine program, the approach to the antibiotics was working. So now let's look at PRRS. This is a very typical late nursery PRRS field virus activity. So somewhere around 7, 8 weeks of age. By the time they went into the finisher, we sampled them. We had at 10 weeks of age, we had 100% of the pigs positive to field virus. So this is ELISA testing here. Percent positive is on the right-hand side, and well, the titer is on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, and the percent positive is on the left-hand side of this chart. Age along the bottom. But this is an example, same flow. A few months later, we had an early nursery exposure. By 6 weeks, we had 100% of the animals positive. Every sample that we did on oral fluids that we sent in was positive. So you might ask, what does this mean for me? And what I'm doing is building that mind picture for you about flexibility. Disease is not going to stay the same month in and month out. Why should our vaccine program stay the same? So you might say, well, I've got an offsite bore stud and it's PRRS naive. On all my testing, it's PRRS naive, but it's mycopositive. So there's an example that you might not want to use PRRS vaccine, but circle and myco. We had situations like that in the bore study. Vaccinating the sow herd, and I'm going to show you a calendar approach now that you can use with that. So it does change, and you might ask, how does this work? Okay, here's an example since 2008 how I've been using the flex combo and the 3-flex and then the individual vaccines to vaccinate sow herds. Let's say we need to vaccinate that sow herd 4 times a year with PRRS vaccine. So let's start in January. So somewhere in the mid-January time period, we gave 3-flex. 3 months later, it was just PRRS. So there's our second vaccine for the year to the sow herd. And then 3 months later, we need PRRS and Microplasma, because that'll be every 6 months on the Microplasma, and then back to PRRS in January. The following year, we can go back to 3-flex. Or, for whatever reason, we've had a few herds do 3-flex 3 times a year. But now we can start to be more flexible with this new technology that you're going to hear more about in just a minute. That is really, really exciting. So we applied this technology, this approach to vaccine, and I want to show you 2 different flows, 2 different sites. These are going to be the grow finish sites. This is the goals for the farm during this time period that the owner, farm manager, and myself placed on us. And you can see that we also had no liquid fat going to this in the feed at this time. And we were trying to sell these animals at 130 kilos. We were achieving our goal the majority of the time. And then the 4th quarter of this year, so over a year and a half, we only had 1 quarter where the mortality went up and performance wasn't as good. So this to me is success, and I'll show you why in just a minute. What these 2 farms had in common were the pathogens. This is a separate flow. This happened to be, again, no liquid fat at the time. I showed you the goals that they set, and they were a little lighter in market weight at 275. And we really struggled with PRDC in 3 quarters, but we were doing pretty good in a year leading up to this. So sometimes it takes longer to get some of these diseases under control than one thinks. What they had in common was both types of PRRS, type 1 to type 2, so the European and the North American. And there was more than one type of North American PRRS over this year and a half. They were both purchasing negative microgilts, trying to enter those into the herd and still trying to control mycoplasma. We're doing a better job of that today. They had a very prescription type approach to antibiotics, used all 3, injectables, orals, feed, and then timely vaccinations during this time period. They were exposed to 2 types of influenza at the same time, or in some finishing units at the same time, but over that year and a half, we had multiple influenza breaks, is what I'm trying to say. So additional thoughts on flexibility. You can now have a prescription-like approach if you want that, and that helps control several things, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. So let's jump into that aspect. When I first started traveling in Southeast Asia as a veterinarian and getting on some of your farms, especially in the Philippines, that was one of the first countries in your part of the world that I got to visit, I would see multiple vaccinations. So we were picking these pigs up and vaccinating them, or in some cases crowding them and vaccinating them in grow finish. And it seemed like pretty frequent. Well, we've been able to move a little bit more to the middle approach. Is it feasible for us to maybe even reduce more vaccinations? Of course, ASF is kind of the problem, the gorilla in the china shop today. And who knows where that's going to go with vaccinations and how that's going to look here. But my point is, without ASF, we have some flexibility now to approach at least this middle. Now, why is this important? I had to do some digging, but back in the 90s, a lot of the universities were looking at what we called segregated early weaning, which means that we wean these pigs at 10 to 14 days of age. We'd place them in a nursery away from everything else. We were learning about biosecurity at the same time. And so the question was, we're given all this kind of vaccines at that time. What is that doing to the growth of these pigs? So they had control barrows in this study, and then they had vaccinated groups. Some were moderately vaccinated, some were intensely vaccinated. And we had this kind of performance. And the just take-home message here is by using just vaccine, we had 4 days longer to get to the same market weight. It did affect muscle a little bit as well. So the take-home message there is if you disrupt that pig's appetite for a long enough period of time, either through disease or through some of our vaccines and handling and crowding, then you're going to change the carcass complex or carcass makeup. Now, there's other papers. I will not go into them at this point, but you can see there's another one out of Canada. Here's another one out of Iowa State. You'll recognize some of those names, Noel Williams, Dr. Staley, and Dr. Zimmerman. Still people active in our industry today, showing what happens to growth and the demands of how you need to change nutrition depending on the disease exposure and so forth. But let's go and look at this paper and look at commercial farms in the 90s versus segregated early weaned pigs, these pigs that are weaned. So what the idea there was, this vertical transmission from sow to offspring, let's break that by weaning early. Vaccinating sow herds in some cases, but by weaning early before possible exposure to certain pathogens. Well, average daily gain was phenomenal. And it all comes back to daily feed intake. That's the difference. So you want these pigs to continue to eat each and every day to their fullest. If we're vaccinating frequently, then this doesn't happen. So the take-home messages are, multiple handling vaccinations can contribute to slower growth. A better pig at weaning, if he starts well, he's going to finish well. As feed intake increases, linear response to lean growth and fat break occurs. Vaccine is one tool in your toolbox. Let's use it correctly. And with that, I want to thank you for this opportunity to bring this to you from the United States. I prefer being there in person, Carmel, but this works, I hope.